For those of you who don't know, we are planning to record this right now, so it will be available after the fact. And we have a number of great panelists with us today. I'm going to introduce them in just a moment. And our plan is to go through a series of questions, hear from our panelists, and then we'll be able to get questions from you all in the chat box. If you go down to the bottom of your screen, there should be something that looks like a little bubble. If you hover over it, it says chat. If you send your questions in the chat, I think to all panelists would be the best means, and we will monitor that there. Does that make sense, Jen?
I would recommend all participants because that way Ennis and I will see too, and we'll just make sure that we can keep an eye on it.
Okay, so in the chat, when you click it, if you want to give a question, it has send to, and you can choose there. Jen, I'm not seeing the all participants as an option, so just to double check, make sure that's there.
Oh yes, that was the thing I had to turn on. Hold, please.
While Jen fixes that, because I'm assuming you won't have any questions yet, I'm going to tell you briefly about Patapsco Heritage Greenway. We are a 501c3. We are well known for our environmental programming, and we also manage the Patapsco Valley Heritage Area, one of 13 certified heritage areas in Maryland. So we hold a number of professional development workshops such as this. We are steadily doing 2 a year. This one was planned for April 7th, I believe, but obviously we could not make it happen in person. I want to thank Chanel Compton, who's one of our panelists, who reached out to me and said, hey, are we going to make this virtual? And I hadn't really thought about it, so I'm glad that she did, and now we are able to do this virtually. As of 2 o'clock, we had 128 people signed up for this workshop, so hopefully a number of you are able to join us. And I just want to say ahead of time, we know this is a little bit clunky, but we're going to do the best we can to get a great conversation going. I think you'll be really impressed with our panelists and the information and the perspectives that they bring. So that being said, I'm going to introduce you to our panelists. We have Chanel Compton, the Executive Director of Banneker-Douglass Museum and the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture. Mr. Louis Diggs, a local historian and author. Dennis Doster, the Black History Program Manager for MNCPPC, the Department of Parks and Rec, PG County. Nastassia Parker, who is a public historian, character interpreter, and lecturer. And Michelle Wright, Associate Professor, History and Africana Studies at the Community College of Baltimore County. Do our panelists want to say hi?
Hello.
Hi, everybody.
Hello, everybody. You can't see me, but I'm Louis Diggs.
Hi, how are you? Nastassia here.
All right, Jen, do you want to bring us to our first question? So our first question is, what is the responsibility of all public history sites to center Black stories? And how can an organization that is rooted in white culture appropriately center Black stories? So I want to make note of 2 or 3 things with this first question. I was asked to define a public history site. I think most people think of public history sites as museums, but there's more to it than that. It's really any site where history is interpreted. So that could be a museum, a library, an archive, a park, a historic site that isn't necessarily one that has a collection. And I think that our speakers will be able to talk a little bit more about other public history sites. So with that being said, does one of my panelists want to jump in on this first question?
I would. This is Chanel.
Let's hear it, Chanel.
Well, it's a really good question, Lindsay. So public sites, and I'm really speaking, within the context of Maryland, because we're in Maryland, but also in a broader national context. Public history sites have a deep responsibility to include diverse Black stories because African American history, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir to many of you, was instrumental in the development of American freedoms and culture. So, for example, the abolitionist movement versus the women's suffrage movement and the civil rights movement would offer new civil liberties to all Americans. So, in addition to that, the history of the transatlantic slave trade supports the global economy, and this history shaped American and modern Western culture and identity. So in Maryland, which was a slaveholding state where enslaved and free African Americans lived, it was a union state, a state that did institute Jim Crow, that was the epicenter of civil rights activism and innovation. So it's to exclude authentic Black narratives from your heritage site or museum is an erasure of history. Also, public history sites have a responsibility to center Black stories that are intersectional, so being inclusive in their programming and their collections and outreach practices, considering not just race, but how gender identity, sexual orientation, class, and ability played a role in impacting those stories. And some of your other questions throughout this discussion, get at the next point, which is what internal work does predominantly white organizations need to do to effectively center Black stories? So my first question would be to the organization, why is your organization predominantly white, right? Looking at, your hiring practices, the geographic area, and not doing that internal work as far as interrogating the white culture within your organization and really dismantling and really understanding how those systems, how that came to be, and not investing in diversity and inclusion internally, you can really cause harm, right? Even if you have the best intentions to center Black stories by, offending your community members, offending your staff. So there's a lot of internal work that should be done, which is more than so. It's a much larger framework. There's a lot of anti-racism organizations to help organizations do this type of diversity and inclusion work. It's difficult work, but it's worth it because, you're able to build new audiences, you're able to attract new board members, you're able to attract new partners, funders, and supporters, you're able to engage in new scholarship and cross-cultural discourse. So it really does, investing in this type of diversity and inclusion is really a part of your organizational relevancy to the community and sustainability. So there's a lot of, so when you're asking how can a predominantly white organization center Black stories, it's so complex, because again, if that internal work doesn't happen as far as interrogating the white fragility within the organization, then centering Black stories, it will be a superficial task.
Thank you, Chanel. That's very important. I'm glad you started us off that way. Nastassia, I think maybe you had wanted to weigh in a little bit on this when we discussed it before.
Yes. So the responsibility, sorry, there's a lot of noise going on in my house. I think the responsibility for all public history sites to center Black stories would be to just kind of not be afraid to tell it like it is, because people really want the truth about African American history, and they look to public history sites and institutions for that accurate information. sorry. The problem is that, at the moment, we live in a politically correct society where sensitive topics such as slavery and the Black experience is a bit of a touchy subject, and a lot of institutions, including I want to say parks, rec and parks, for example. It's a touchy subject, and not a lot of people know exactly how to touch on that. So I guess getting back to what I'm saying is just not really be afraid to really talk about it and to focus on the historical aspect of what African American history is, if that makes any sense.
No, that makes sense. Thank you. Dennis, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I definitely wanted to jump in. I think one of the key words that, Chanel brought up, and that I'm sure you'll hear all of us say through this conversation, is about diversity. And so about having our public history sites reflect the diversity of our national and local communities. So it's important for people, when they go into these sites, to see themselves and their stories being told in these sites. And also it's important for people to see, it might not be their particular story, but to see the story of their neighbors in these sites. And so I think that, that diversity is key. It's also this important education part. And so as we think about the political climate that we're in, these times that we're in that are very divided, thinking about how public history sites and telling these stories and centering Black stories can go a long way to helping to, educate people and help to correct the stories that are out there that are false, to, help to create empathy, help to build bridges, and even help to affect change in some sort of way. And just thinking about this question, it makes me think about a project that I'm currently working on, and it's actually for next year, and we've been working on it for a little bit, but it's so appropriate now. We were looking at doing some research and doing some stories around Blacks and healthcare and healing practices and medicine and all of that. So that's so apropos for the moment when we think about what's going on with this pandemic, and we think about how African American, Black communities, people of color are being disproportionately affected. And often what you see out there in these stories, a lot of times you see these stories are coming out as kind of blaming of people of color for what's happening. And why don't you just stay home and you'll be all right? But if you know that complete story, you'll know that it's not just something as simple as that. You'll know about the history of inequities in our healthcare system, which have led to the inequities now. You'll know about cultural practices that are rooted in the period of slavery that kind of feed into what's going on now. You'll know about this distrust of the healthcare system because of the past injustices within the healthcare system that feed into what's going on now. So it creates a much more complex and fuller story that is a story that needs to be understood if we're going to take it to the next level. So I think that is just like one example of something that I'm working on now, but definitely I think it will speak to kind of how centering a Black story can help to advance a narrative, correct misconceptions out there, and help to hopefully eventually affect change in the broader society. And then to the second part of the question about how the organization rooted in white culture can appropriately center Black stories, I think definitely it's realizing where you are lacking and what you need, and then not being afraid to go out and get those resources. So that might be professional development for you and your staff. That definitely would be reaching out to community partners, so African American, Black communities, organizations, individuals, building those relationships with them, personal relationships, so that they can help you in collectively advancing these stories, curating exhibitions, developing programming, reaching out to the academic community, so experts in your local community who have the historical knowledge as it relates to these Black stories. So building this broad coalition that can support you in this work.
Thank you, Dennis. Before we move on, did Michelle or Mr. Diggs want to weigh in on this question?
Yes, I would, Lewis.
Okay.
Oh, good. Thank you. on what is the responsibility of all public history sites to center Black stories. There's one thing that I really have to say. Now, I have been dealing only with researching African American life in Baltimore County, extremely huge county. But most of the history that I have found, the average person, it's difficult to go beyond when, from those 19 slaves on. From that point on, they have no history. They've been known as African Americans, but I have found that when I was researching, and I've done hundreds of oral histories, and I started this 31 years ago, and I began my oral histories only from people 70 years old and older. Therefore, I've been able to capture people that have discussed, have talked about, secondhand their what it was like during the slavery era. But in order to even begin to capture the Black stories, there's got to be ways to have researchers go into these communities trying to capture elder African Americans where you can gather stories from them. And the main point that I would like to make is like this, taking this county, which was 25% African American, been there for many years, some 350 years, and I still have the reels of video and audio tapes of people, quite a few of them, 100 years old or older. This is what we need to capture. I don't know how far we're going to go in these Black stories, but it's things like this that needed to be transcribed by responsible people. And I go along with Dennis on organizations in white cultures that do assist in gathering African American history. And I have quite a few white descendants of slave owners, and who have provided so much information, primarily about their slaves that more or less are domesticated. But I found in today's world, it's very easy to have whites assist in capturing these stories. That's my comments.
Thank you, Mr. Diggs. Jen, I'm going to ask that we go on to the next slide. And we touched on this question a bit, but we're just going to focus on the field-wide issues. Often organizations have internalized structures or norms that discourage or make dangerous the centering of Black stories. How can we as a field overcome these obstacles? And Michelle, if you have anything to add, I thought we could start with you.
We can't hear Michelle.
You might be muted, Michelle.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, there we go.
Okay, I just wanted to say that moving past the idea of historical sites is that every place that we walk on this earth is a historical site. So moving past things that we have sort of designated. So for example, I'm on a college campus that is a historic site because it used to be a plantation. So it's not just the sites that need to, or the organizations. It kind of moves beyond a little bit that. I wanted to kind of say that from before. But moving on to sort of the internalized structures. I think there's been in history, at least in the historic discipline, there's always been a tendency to privilege white male voices and to privilege traditional historical research. So, I mean, as a trained historian, I know I've been trained to do that myself, to only take something that has been formally documented, whether it is in a primary or even a secondary source, as being the truthful way of looking at history. That's more of a Eurocentric way of looking at history, as something that has been documented and that can be proved and we can look at a piece of paper and says that it's been written down. I think that especially what Mr. Diggs is doing is moving past that oral history, and oral history not just interviewing people, but understanding there may have been stories that have been passed down. There may have been other legends and other things that we can kind of take a hold of and realize that just because white males have written the documented history, whether it is the ownership of land or of people or of other things, that there are other ways to look at history that might be a little bit less traditional, and understand that we ourselves hold history as well. All of us hold some type of a history. In my classes, my students have to do an oral history project where they have to interview someone they know about a historical event significant in African American history, and they're always surprised to find out that history surrounds us everywhere, not just hanging on a wall in a museum or in a sculpture or on a plaque or a memorial sign on the side of the road. That history is everywhere if we're open to the fact that it is there, and open to the fact that just because you can't particularly find a specific document, that there can't be other creative ways of looking towards those histories and understanding that. In the history discipline, primary sources are the ones that are privileged. Primary sources meaning people who are actually at the event, who actually recorded it. But as we know through history, African descended people were precluded from being able to record events. African descended people were precluded from having a voice during those times. So that leaves us with a big void. But that doesn't mean that there aren't any other things like cultural artifacts and other important items, textiles, other things that can still tell the story. And we need to be open to the fact that even if it's not found in an archive, in an old dusty box, with that's been authenticated by a group of people, we can still learn history from other objects, from place, from looking at the way a building was built and seeing how it connects to maybe traditional African building methods. There are other ways to look at history, and I think a lot of times in traditional institutions that those voices aren't centered because we come up with the excuse that, well, it's just not there. We can't find it in the archives. We can't find it in the library. It's not available. So I just think that a way to overcome that is to look at history as more vast and not something that is just static on a timeline. That's something that is just that we need to go and just do research. There are other ways to learn about things that have happened in the past.
Michelle, what an important set of points, and I'm going to ask you a quick follow-up, if that's okay.
Sure.
I come from the public history field, and so this is a conversation that comes up often, is the lack or the perceived lack of resources, archival material, collections, just like you're saying, that are giving the Black perspective and enabling these sites to center Black stories. Do you have any advice for professionals in the position where they might need to look beyond the traditional archival or collections that they have, and what they should maybe communicate to their superiors or to the general public about the importance of those other types of research that can be done and valued equally?
I can just use some personal examples of some of the things that I have done. Now, I'm working on, I'm centered on the CCBC campus in Catonsville, and that campus was a plantation, not only a plantation of tobacco, which many people assume, but also an iron plantation, so an industrial plantation, as well as thoroughbred horse training and breeding, where African American men were very central to that. Enslaved African American men were central. So there's no records on the men who were there working in the iron industry. There's no records of the individual men who actually raised those horses that I have found yet. But you have to do a lot of contextual research around. So if I'm doing equestrian enslavement, which is an emerging field of no understanding the importance of black men, especially men, in equestrian enslavement during the 19th century, then you do have to look at the primary sources. Who owned the horses? Who purchased these human beings in order to train the horses? But then you can go back further and understand the equestrian tradition in West Africa and how some of these human beings that were purchased from Africa were chosen for that exact purpose. And what were the traditions of horse breeding and training in West Africa that have been transferred into horse breeding and training here in the United States? What is specific to the state of Maryland? What would these men have done to train some of these horses who raced at Belmont and Saratoga and other places, and were living right here in Baltimore County, who were creating this situation that created wealth for the owners of, and it's sort of like this dual ownership of owning horses and then owning human beings to train these horses, both of which are there to help you create wealth. And there's more records on the horses and their breeding, their names, where they came from, where they were purchased, than the men who actually trained them. So you have to do contextual research, and you look at what you're trying to find. So if you're looking for, iron industry in Frederick County, and you can find that, there's going to be peripheral information out there. The primary sources are going to be the owners of the iron industry, the owners of the land, the owners of that. But there's going to be other things that are going on, and I would say Catoctin is doing a really good job with that. And Arch and some other organizations in Frederick County are putting together a really good story of using the context of things that are surrounding it and sort of putting together a piece of the puzzle. Maybe that primary source written by that white man is going to be central to sort of extrapolating all of that stuff. But you need to fill in all of those colors. It's like it's just a black and white drawing, and you need to color it in and fill in and flesh it out and add more depth to the overarching picture that you're trying to create of these African descended people.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Michelle.
Lindsay, if I could just jump in and add something on, I was also thinking about some examples that kind of speak to that as well, and kind of links back to our initial question too about how do you do this work, and part of it can be just looking at what you already have and looking at how you interpret it in new and different ways. And so, like, for example, recently I and some colleagues went to the American Civil War Museum in Richmond. So the vast majority of their collection came from the Daughters of the Confederacy. And how it was interpreted for decades was telling the story of, the glories of the Confederacy. But, now they're doing very important and great work with looking at those same artifacts and interpreting them in new and different ways. So looking at all these textiles that they have and using that to talk about the role that African American women specifically had in textile production, are looking at craftsmanship of certain furniture and looking at, African American men and how they were involved in that. And just like you can go down the list of artifacts that they have, and they're looking at them in new and different ways. And so I think that's something we can also do, look at what's already in our collection. And we may have told it from this one perspective for decades, but look at how we can tell it from a new and different perspective.
Yeah.
I'd like to comment on Michelle, if I may, please.
Sure.
On some of the things Michelle mentioned in her comments, which are really nice about Catonsville Community College. And of course, I lived in Catonsville myself for 50 years. I wasn't born there, but I have found in my research in Catonsville and really all over Baltimore County, where people, slaves, were used for different kinds of work, like she mentioned, working with horses, or the majority of them did working with tobacco, as long as it was, temperature remained pretty close to. Virginia was very, really into Baltimore County, which is one of the reasons why they had a large, many slaves. But I can take, for example, up in North County, this is where I have found slaves who work with horses. Uh, some of them, their descendants, after slavery ended, when they came out of slavery, they made money training these horses. And I have even pictures of them getting the awards or whatever when they race at Pimlico or wherever they go. And the names, oh my goodness, I have found so many names as I go further and further back into research I was doing as a single person. I have found many names that can be associated with some of the slaves. Just to give you a good example is really about myself. My family came from a place called Bullring, Maryland, and they were slaves held by John B. Digges, Digges. He released the slaves early on, but as slaves, he used them to take the goods from the hinterland into vegetables, etc., into the in a harbor, and that road along Route 30 was called the Diggs. It had a certain name that reflected the name of these of the ancestors, and I had them that raced. This is after slavery. That raced at the I can't think of the name of the something Pikesville, the racetrack, and one of my great uncles, he could not be beat by racing down and turning on the down and coming back, but these are the kind of stories that I have accumulated over the years, and I just didn't believe that you find this sort of information all over, at least Maryland, and this I know. It's just a point, if you don't mind, I'd like to have commented on.
Thank you. I think it's great to see that local connection, and I'm sure your research and Michelle's overlaps quite a bit.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah. Mr. Diggs has helped me considerably in my research, so thank you.
Nastassia or Chanel, did either of you want to chime in on this before we go to the next question?
Probably just a little bit. But as far as how we can overcome the obstacles, I definitely think that we could definitely use some more support from organizations and historic sites, whether it's with protecting their employees, their costume interpreters from harassment, whether it's racial harassment or sexual harassment, possibly offer counseling to help with emotional and or psychological distress. Because let's face it, when you're portraying or interpreting a part of African American history that was primarily traumatic, I'll just say that from my own personal standpoint, and I'm just going to be real quick about it. I had an experience where I was doing a full immersion experiment at a small institution where you could not break character for anything. So, case in point, if you wanted to take a break, or if you just couldn't, you were obviously in character. You were portraying a slave the entire time, and you had to do that for the entire weekend. So, after that was said and done, I can tell you that I noticed emotionally I was just exhausted, very distraught. There was a residual of post-traumatic stress disorder because the person that I was portraying was a runaway slave. So there was this constant having to look over your shoulder and distrust of people, of white people, which, was the strangest thing that I've ever had to do. And just not only that, but putting my trust into 30 or more participants that were all part of this experiment, knowing that we had a meeting prior to this experiment of, okay, how are we going to interpret a runaway scenario? How are we going to interpret Nastassia being captured and being sold off, and how are we going to do this correctly without overstepping those boundaries? I can't say it worked exactly well because, again, at the end of it, I was just completely like I had tuned out at that point. So when I say that, needing therapy, it's not just people, not just me that would actually need to go to a therapist to kind of get back on track, but can you imagine that um, um, other participants or costume interpreters who do this every day at the institutions of where they work at, and they do this every day, and um, they deal with visitors who come in and constantly ask them, are you a slave? Was your master kind to you? Did this happen? Did that happen? And just getting so many comments and having to internalize all of that for years and years and years and not really have an outlet. Can you imagine how that would affect you mentally and emotionally? So I really think that is definitely something that I really think institutions really need to focus on, especially with their employees, because, you're dealing with the psyche, and that is a very, with Psychology 101, that is a very delicate thing you kind of have to focus on. And the other thing that I think that we can definitely do with overcoming, and I know I mentioned this earlier, is, for institutions to not be afraid of just not being afraid to tell it like it is, not be afraid to create exhibits that talk about talk about American history, African American history, and talk about slavery, and not sugarcoat it. We're at this point in time where people want the truth. They want to know what really happened because we have a lot of misinformation, and it comes all the way down to Hollywood. It comes down to the textbooks that we were given, and I hate to say it, but most of the textbooks that we have been given, that I have seen through, high school and elementary school, even college, some of that stuff is outdated, and it's just there's a lot that needs to be addressed. And at this point, and I'm really glad we're doing this, at this point we're addressing the elephant in the room. So what we're trying to do now is figure out how to get the elephant out of here so we can, just kind of build up from scratch. So that's my take on it at the moment.
Thank you. I think we often, especially in the museum field, don't hear very much from first-person interpreters, so I think that's a really important perspective to have, and I appreciate you sharing it. Chanel, did you want to add anything?
Just real quick. I think that, Lindsay, what you're doing, as far as this is just a really great example of building connection and partnerships and coalition building. All of that is critical to overcoming these institutional systems. And I think that, this work is so necessary as far as, furthering an institution into greater sustainability and relevance. But to your point, as far as how can an organization with internalized structures discourage or make dangerous centering Black stories, I think a lot of that comes from isolation. So, I've definitely felt the microaggressions from working with predominantly with ethnically diverse organizations to PWI organizations when, I was asking the right questions as far as, why isn't this person, quote unquote, in the room, and, challenging the norms. And I think that what has helped me personally is, having peer mentors, seeking mentors in the field, building those partnerships, having these types of discussions, reading, and that has helped me a great deal, because I think that if we are talking about organizational cultural change, that work takes time. This isn't something that's just going to happen. That work takes time, and that work needs to be consistent. So I know this word has come around so much, and if anyone, I'm sure most of you have heard this word and is probably sick of it, but self-care is so important, and a part of that self-care is connecting with others in the field to see, like, Louis Diggs or Dennis Doster or Nastassia and Michelle and Lindsay, and connecting with your colleagues to see what they're doing as far as best practices. So, yeah, I think that just coalition building and partnerships are critical.
Oops, I have myself muted. Chanel, I think that's really important, and you mentioned PWI, which I'm assuming is predominantly white institutions.
Yeah.
So I think that the perspective you're sharing is also being shared in the chat, and we have a comment from Chris Haley, who I believe is with the Maryland State Archives, and he said, as a longtime researcher in Maryland on the subject of slavery and its legacy, it's often very challenging to study in depth such racially based atrocities and accepted practices without clear understanding by the administrators how stressful this can be. You have to then take a break of your own accord and speak with persons who do the same, often and repeatedly, to decompress and share the difficulty. Self-care, quite frankly. So I think what's important, and I want to note this as a white woman who is obviously, when I do this research, it's not the same, right? And I think many of these institutions who are PWI, as Chanel has mentioned, may not realize quite how stressful and quite how painful it can be for people of color to do this research and do this work and this interpretation. So I'm glad we were able to touch on that, because I think it's a really important perspective.
Right, and Chris is the director of the archives.
Okay. Chris, I'm glad you're on the call.
Lindsay, if I could add one thing too.
Sure.
And this loops back to something that Chanel mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation. I think another thing that we have to look at in terms of our internalized norms and how we change them are hiring practices. So, having diverse people that are at the table, not just as our community partners, but are that actually in the building, in the house, leading and driving these efforts. And so thinking about how do we, rethink our hiring practices so that we have more diversity and so that we have those people at the table helping to make those decisions. And I'm thinking about my own experiences and thinking about how important internships were for me to get started in the field. So thinking about how can we expand internships and how can we, being realistic, when we think about people of color, often they can't afford to do free internships. So thinking about how do we offer paid opportunities for people to get their foot in the door and get those opportunities. And then also how do we, once they have their foot in the door, how do we help to nurture them, to mentor them, and to make sure that they, move up through the ranks? Because I've been in multiple situations where, those things have been stymied. And it's great to have the support of African Americans and other people of color in your organization to try and help you, but you also need other people who are not people of color to realize that these are issues and these are struggles, and have them speaking out and helping to move you along as well.
Thank you, Dennis. Lots of unpaid internships. The worst part of our field that needs to be fixed. I agree with you on that one. Jen, can we go to the next question? And I want to make a note to our presenters and our participants just about time. We're aiming to end at 3:30. We've gotten through a couple of questions. We have a couple more. So we want to make sure if you have any questions, throw them in the chat and I'll try to incorporate them as we go along. So for our next question, we've already answered a little bit of it, I think, with Michelle and Mr. Diggs, but I think we have more that we can add. For an organization that isn't sure how much Black history there is to their site, where do you recommend they start their research? So, Dennis, do you want to start with that? If not, I can call on someone else.
So where do you recommend that they start their research? I think we heard a lot of great things from Mr. Diggs and Michelle about sources, so I won't restate those things, and they might want to go in more depth about them. But I think one of the big things that people can take advantage of, and it's something that, personally in my position that our organization is trying to do more, is try to link with local colleges and universities and really get more partnerships with them to get students, whether they be undergraduate students or graduate students, to help us with the research. Because the reality is, for a lot of us working in smaller institutions, we have tons of things on our plate. So we may love to do research, but we might not have the time to do it with all of the other responsibilities that we have. So that if we can build these partnerships and get people to do this type of work, that's very important. So I'm immediately thinking about, in the Prince George's County community, thinking about the Lakeland Community Heritage Project, and how Professor Sees over in American Studies that has done great work with working with the community organization and doing a lot of research. And there was even a book, I think, that came out of it. And so a lot of that work that is being done with the community in relationship with colleges and universities. And so having them to help us with advancing this type of research. And a lot of, and if you think about, especially on the graduate level, a lot of students are interested in doing local studies. And so if we can tap into that, I think that's a great opportunity that we don't necessarily always take advantage of.
Thank you.
Can I piggyback on it, Lindsay? This is Michelle.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah, I think what Dennis says is very, very true. Our students they're hungry to find out more, and they're also always fascinated to find out that there's stuff that's right there, whether it's in their family, in their backyard. And I have my students do a great deal of research on things that I learn new things from them every day. And it's always fascinating. So yeah, and that's the next way. That's also the way to kind of nurture the next generation of those of us who are going to be continuing this work. But I also want to add that we're very, very lucky in our location where we are in Maryland to have so many wonderful resources that we can access. We are a quick drive to the Library of Congress, the National Archives. I mean, people come from around the country to do the research that we can go. I mean, a lot of these things are digitized and they are online. So I would say that's a good place to start if you're starting to do your research, is to look at some of these digitized sources. But I mean, if you want to go, I mean, there's no more beautiful place than the Library of Congress to do your research. The National Archives I've used extensively, but even a quick drive to Annapolis here in the Baltimore area to go to the Maryland State Archives are abundant with information. We have the Maryland Historical Society here in the city of Baltimore, and then there are so many different local historical societies. And I would say for organizations, no matter where they are, I'm assuming most of the people who are listening today are in the Maryland area, somewhere in the state of Maryland. Your county has a historical society. Your town has a historical society, and there's an abundance of that. Also, individual libraries. A lot of times we don't realize that individual libraries have special collections. So if you're doing research, and I keep going back to Catonsville, but if you're doing research on Catonsville, the Catonsville Library has a Catonsville room that has history specifically about the Catonsville area. So if you're doing research for something that's in that area, but you could say that probably about any community in the area, there's going to be a historical society, and it's worth joining to continue these organizations on nominal fees of $10, $15, $20 to join, get you in the door to look at some amazing information and to talk to, whether they're the docents, whether they're the people who work there. They may know something and give you some resources as well and push you on to the next thing. And here's the last one I will say, and this is just sort of me being a dork. Whenever I get a new book about a subject I find interesting historically, before I even read the book, I look at the index and the bibliography. And the index and the bibliography can take you even deeper, and the footnotes on the pages as well can take you even deeper, and then you find more specific information. So if you are reading something that's very general in nature, but you're more focused on this one thing, that bibliography, those footnotes, all of those things are going to take you, and you will find another resource. So it's ongoing. I mean, as you read books, you find 10 other books that you want to read, or 10 other resources they'll say, well, oh, this is in the archive in XYZ. So always look in the back of the book and the bottom of the page for more resources as well, which is always very, very, very helpful. But again, take advantage of what we have. We have a lot right here in the Maryland, D.C. area that just is an abundance of information that can give us so much, and the people who work there as well.
Thank you, Michelle.
This is Lewis. I would like to comment on this.
Sure.
Okay. What I'm going to talk about is purely basic research. I don't involve myself beyond Baltimore County. However, the end result has been I've just been so happy with volunteering for 31 years and doing what I did. But believe it or not, I started from the Catonsville Library, not the library, the school system. My kids thought after I retired that I could go to Catonsville High School, where there were a little problems with the boys, and they only had one male black teacher there. So they convinced me that I must go and become a role model. I had no interest in being a substitute teacher. And my interest comes from, I'm retired from the military. I've been retired 50 years. And for 10 years, I was sergeant major at Morgan State College, helping to generate officers. And even when I retired, I went into the DC school system, starting as a ROTC instructor. So anyhow, I went there just to be a role model. It worked fine. But it ended up, principal knew that I had some interest in research. And he asked me would I speak to the kids about it, maybe do a class, which I did. And the kids from the Winters Lane community, in this class that I was teaching, they found all about their parents, but they knew nothing about it. How did Winters Lane start? Why did they come to Winters Lane in particular? And some very, very interesting questions that they asked. And at the end of the class, they asked me if I could help them find the history. And I tried to make it clear to them that really I was born in Baltimore City. But my wife was working in the library, and she put pressure on me. So this is when I started. And Baltimore County itself picked me up. One day there was some activity going on in Catonsville, and I was sharing some history, and I can't think of the gentleman's name, nor the department he was from, but he said, you're doing the same thing we're doing, and why don't you keep doing, and you can work with us. That's fine. I'll try that. And this is where I really got my start and really found that this local community truly appreciated the information that I had gotten together for them. 13 books. When I go to talk around the state sometimes people do not believe me. Baltimore County paid for every book that I have produced. They say, no way the county is not. It all depends on how you approach your county. You'd really be surprised. And all these things can be a high motivation factor for people to come in. And it is really hard to get volunteers, believe me. But what it can lead to is just recently, the state gave me $400,000 to take an old church, restore it, and convert it to a museum where I really share thousands of images and artifacts, etc., and talks that I give every month at my museum. But see, all of this can start with a motivated individual, just from the basic start, and who knows where it would take him. Now, I can't do any more books, 88 years, and my fingers just can't do it anymore. And I'm trying to get my museum, Dickens Johnson Museum, over to some of my sons to take that over. But me, it really truly starts in a church. You go into a church, that's where you get some basic information about people who can give you information, especially the older ones. And I have went through every church in Baltimore County, just gleaning all kinds of information, and everything has worked out fine. Just a comment I wanted to make.
Thank you, Mr. Diggs. Hearing that is important, and the churches are definitely a resource to look to. I wanted to hear from Nastassia, I think, or Chanel or Dennis about any other, in addition to the major ones that Michelle has named, local resources that Mr. Diggs has named, as well as churches. Did you all have anything to add?
I think that, and I love like the different levels of, or a broadened definition of who is the expert, because you don't necessarily have to work for a state archive or a museum or a library to be an expert on local Black history in your area. So I use the example like Fairmont Heights was the first African American, the third or fourth African American township to incorporate in Prince George's County. And there's a woman, her name is Nancy Saxon. And I say this, there's always a Nancy Saxon. and I know many of you on the call probably know Miss Saxon, but Miss Saxon was instrumental in getting an African American history exhibit at the Fairmont Heights Library. And there's always elders in a community that will be more than happy to sit down and share oral history or actually primary resources of the African American history in that area. And I will say this, even from folks that work in institutions, I'm the director of the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture, as well as the Banneker-Douglass Museum. And I don't really care how busy we are on staff or at the commission. Anytime an organization comes to us with those concerns and wanting to have dialogue and do more Black history programming at their site, we always take those conversations, and they're typically fruitful conversations. So just being unafraid to engage with community partners, individuals that you haven't in the past, don't be afraid. You know what I mean? Because I've never had anyone kind of, unless their approach was completely wrong and offensive, I've never seen. That type of connection and desire to connect is typically always welcomed. So go for it.
Thank you, Chanel.
One thing I'll add, just piggybacking off of Chanel and just re-emphasizing, and I think a number of people have said that oral histories are important as a research tool. for getting at these stories, because these stories, often are not in the traditional written sources that we're looking at, and being able to connect with individuals in the community is so important in getting those oral histories, and then also I think that connects to partially one of the questions in the chat about how do you recruit more volunteers of color, because by doing these types of projects where you're reaching out to people in the community and connecting with them, you're building a rapport, you're gaining their trust, and then they'll more likely want to be involved with you in some sort of way, and you'll be able to go back to them, and they'll come back to you, and you'll develop this relationship, which can lead to volunteering in different types of ways.
Thank you, Dennis. That was actually one of the questions about attracting volunteers of color. So I think you've answered it without me having to ask.
And oral history, real quick, oral history is a primary resource.
Yes.
Yes,
it is. Yeah.
Yes, it is.
For sure.
Can you say that one more time for the people in the back?
Yeah, oral history, especially first-hand accounts, are a primary resource.
Thank you. So I'm monitoring the chat. We have a question from Allison. Allison, I believe that Michelle is trying to message you directly, or will be, so we're going to get that answered. And then we also have another question about is having costume interpreters portraying traumatic experiences, such as an enslaved person and others, something organizations should avoid in most cases? If this portrayal is happening, how can organizations build working environments to support those interpreters, in addition to mental health coverage, therapy, encouraging self-care? And I would like to broaden that question beyond costume interpreters, because I think that's important, but I think it might also be useful to talk about what we discussed earlier with having staff people, and if you're bringing in volunteers who are people of color, doing research, interpretation, programming about really, really difficult topics that they are asked to address in a professional way. How can we better support them in the field?
Natasha, you should start with that.
Well, actually, that's a very good question. I think personally for me, I think that having costume characters or interpreters are really important, because it actually humanizes the experience. Case in point, if you are going to any museum or any public history site, it shows a very different, you get a very different perspective. Because case in point, if you were to go to see an exhibit and you don't really, you're not able to you're not able to see the big picture, in other words. But if you actually, or even ask the questions that you want to ask, because, the people from long past have, passed away. But if you have a costume character there, or someone who can actually interpret, who has done the research and the development, and has the experience to answer those questions and to interact with you, you get a whole different experience. Case in point, when I was partnered with an institution last year, I was actually portraying Ona Judge, and I noticed that it was a couple of young students from all over came in, and as soon as they saw me, they didn't even know who I was at the point, but they knew what I was doing there. And the first thing they did was, "Oh my gosh, you're somebody just like us." They made that connection. And then when I kept talking and doing my thing, asking where they came from and things like that, and telling them a little bit about Ona Judge's story, they started asking questions. They started wanting to know more and starting to understand the connection a lot better than what they're able to read in history books and in the textbooks and what they were taught. So, but as far as, what we can do to actually help interpreters as far as mental health coverage, therapy, encouraging self-care, I hate to say it, but it's kind of our responsibility to do that because at the end of the day, we can take as many breaks as we want, as long as, if we need it, but still, um, it really has to do with the healing portion of it. If you are, like case in point with me, if I know that I'm completely overwhelmed by a situation and I need to take a step back, then I have to figure out a way. How am I going to ground myself? How am I going to get myself out of being first person where I know I'm in a very a conflicted situation, and how can I get myself to, okay, hey, Nastassia, this is way too much. You need to take a step back. And trust me, I'm not the only one that this happens to. There are several tricks that I've heard other interpreters say that help them kind of snap back into reality, so that way they can just kind of decompress for a minute. But having costume interpreters with public sites is extremely important because, as I said before, it humanizes the experience. It makes you want to ask more questions. It makes you want to have that connection, and it makes you want to also think as well. It makes you want to have a different form of opinion because, let's say, for example, you go into a museum thinking one thing, and once you're finished coming out of the museum, you're thinking something completely different. Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, yeah, something along those lines. Sorry, I couldn't think off the top of my head at that point.
May I ask a question, Natasha, and
Sure.
as it relates to that? Do you find that being an interpreter, is it more psychologically taxing to do historic interpretations when you have visitors kind of engaging with you one-on-one or coming up to you during a tour, or versus doing something that's more stage-based where you're taking questions from an audience and you're more so controlling the control? Like, is there more control within the space? Like, do you prefer one or the other?
I like both, but I do feel like I have more control when it's stage based.
Right.
Because with Ona Judge, she's completely scripted, so I don't really have any true interaction with the audience until after the stage play is over. Usually, I just come back on stage and do the question and answer.
Yeah.
But I normally do that as me and not as Ona, so that way I separate myself from that character. Unless there are younger audiences that don't realize that, then I can jump right back into it. When I am portraying other characters that on site that require that one-on-one interaction, or if school groups happen to come in, you're basically it can be a bit emotionally taxing, especially if depending on the situation. If it's just curious minds wanting to know who you are, what it is you're doing, what life was like for you during that specific time period, then that's a little different. But if it's there are times where there are situations where, as I mentioned before, it can be a bit intense. But that, for me personally, those situations are very rare because doing the full immersion exercise that I do each year, I have to be emotionally and psychologically prepared for that weeks ahead. And in addition to that, talk to the 30 other people who are participating in this experiment and say, okay, this didn't work the last time. So what can we do, or what needs to be done this time so we can make improvements so everybody is on board and there's no, we don't have any hiccups along the line. So case in point, if I happen to be feeling or experiencing emotional or psychological distress, I let somebody know I have a code word or something like that, or a safety word. And then they say, okay, she needs to go for a minute and recollect herself. She'll be back. If I'm dealing with a visitor who happens to be a bit aggressive, then again, safety word, and somebody goes in and takes care of the situation, which I have had happen before. And on my first day on the job, I've had a visitor harass me racially, and thank goodness the supervisor that was there who with me at that time, she handled it professionally like a boss. And so, yes, to answer your question, Chanel, it works both ways, but at the same time, it can be emotionally and psychologically taxing. But it really depends on the situation. Sometimes I can control it, and sometimes I can't.
Really quickly, so I asked, and it's interesting your response. I am emotionally more triggered and exhausted by the one-on-one engagement with interpreters versus something that's more stage-based. It's for me. This is what I do as far interpreting African American history, art, and culture. But it's really difficult to interact with historic interpreters.
Yeah, and I can understand that. I over the years, and I started volunteering at at one of the institutions in Virginia when I was really young, and over the time period, I started when I was 9. So I'm not going to give my age now, but over a 25-year span, I kind of sort of desensitized myself a little bit, so it wouldn't affect me as much, so that way I can actually do my interpretation, do my job correctly. But there are some times where things could be a bit deep and hard-hitting, and it would catch me off guard. But yeah, I can totally understand where you're coming from. And, with doing what we do as a form of education, because there are a lot of people who are more hands-on and more visual learners rather than book learners, which is actually one of the reasons why I do this.
Yeah.
I just lost my train of thought. I think it's really important. Just hands down, it's really important. But it is hard hitting.
I had it's kind of a comment / question to you, Nastassia, as well, about this work, and I will put out there the caveat that generally I don't like costume interpretation at sites, and I think it has a lot to do with, as Chanel said, that triggering that it does. And so a few years ago, I had the opportunity to work with the Akakik Foundation, and they were kind of rethinking costume interpretation at their site and trying to think about how to broaden it out and think about different ways to do it, and and talking about how in dealing with a lot of people of color, they were not fans of it and didn't want to come to that site or other sites because they were like, oh, we're going to deal with someone dressed as a slave again. So thinking about how do you counteract that, how are the ways that you broaden out costume interpretation, and then also I think maybe if you could talk about professional development too, because I think that's a piece of it, because a lot of times it's done poorly, and so that turns people off. And so, what are the ways in which, what are the places that you would say that you can go to get people, or you can send people so that they do this type of work correctly?
Okay, definitely good questions. I would definitely say that there is definitely a reason why a lot of people are a little apprehensive about costume interpretation, because yes, slavery and the Reconstruction era, those are, I want to say, the hardest hitting moments in Black history, because we still have that that speculation of the happy slave narrative. And I hate saying that word, but excuse me, it just seems to be it just seems to be that stigma in history that we work really hard with trying to correct. And it all goes down to misinformation, again, because of things that we have seen in Hollywood, things that we have seen during the Jim Crow era, textbooks, things just with the source material. I'll just to broaden that for you. But I think the reason why that's one of the reasons why people are really apprehensive about it. The second reason is because, it's a very difficult subject to talk about. Not a lot of people want to talk about slavery. Not a lot of people want to talk about, that portion of the Black experience, because that's all we tend to talk about. We don't talk about anything pertaining to inventors. We don't talk about leaders. We don't talk about educators. We don't really talk about things like that in African American history. It seems like society only wants to talk about the dark side or the negative side of African American history. Everything pertaining to when we got here in 1611, all the way to now, there is so much history that we can actually touch on, and so much, even the, I'm trying to think of the actual names of the different towns that nobody really knows about. For example, Pocahontas Island in Virginia, in Petersburg, Virginia, there is Freedman's Village, which is now Arlington National Cemetery. I forgot the name of the town that is now Central Park, and even with Black Wall Street, that a lot of people don't really know about those things. The only thing that they know pertaining to Black history is the fact that we were kidnapped and we were brought here as slaves, and that's the whole stigma. That's all people see as, oh, this is our Black history. I don't want to have anything to do with this. As Chanel says, it triggers a negative emotion. So a lot of people kind of are apprehensive about wanting to portray Black history in general, knowing that that's not all that there is to it there. But as far as the different institutions or places that we as interpreters can go to, there are several different places with interpretation or courses and things that we can take to actually improve. There's the National Association of Interpretation, or the NAI. There's also the I forgot the name, the ALHFAM. I don't remember I know the acronym, but I don't know the whole word for it. But they're smaller, actually there are large organizations that actually do help with interpretation and how to improve. So I hope that answers your question, Dennis. I know that's a pretty lengthy one, but
Oh, no, that was perfect. Yeah. Thank you.
So let me see. I'm not on mute. Okay, great. So it's the Association for Living History Farm and Agricultural Museums, I think is what you're referencing. Okay. And I can put that link in the chat just in case anyone's interested. So I had said we were going to end at 3:30. I think we're going to go a little bit over, but I'm going to condense a couple of questions that we had into one. And Jen, if I can ask you to go to the last slide, that would be great. I want everyone to make sure that you have contact info, the very last slide. Yes. So we have everyone's contact information if you're trying to grab that before the call ends. But the question that I wanted to get to, which I've just invented based on some conversations that we had before and this call so far, is about the multitude of Black stories. and the Black diaspora, and how sites can focus on or be sure to not just be telling the first story that they find or the easiest story to find. And I think maybe if we could start with Chanel with that might be something you might be able to speak to.
So repeat. I don't. So you're talking about as far as diversity and Black storytelling?
Sure. So I think that many predominantly white institutions, when they start to do this research, often they find one story and they kind of stop there.
Right.
Whether that's the story of the enslaved people or that's the story from the church that they had access to or whatever. But I think it would be useful to talk about the broader stories, not just within small communities, but the diaspora and the diversity of Black stories that could be incorporated.
So I think that along with that storytelling, in conjunction with that, there's relationship building, right? So if you're a predominantly white institution who's invested in internal diversity and inclusion, the first thing that needs to happen alongside interrogating your own systems of exclusion, right, is making sure that your reach is your outreach is broad, not focusing on developing a relationship with that one church in the area, but speaking with other organizations, speaking with other community members, speaking with other volunteers, really investing in this institutional cultural uplift is critical. So that takes work, that takes time, that takes intentionality. So because with those different varied relationships, be it the local church, be it a local artist collective, and so forth, you're going to get a myriad of stories to tell. Another thing is making sure that there is equity when it comes to the roles of how the story is being told, and equity in a sense that, and this goes to board governance and organizational governance. You know, I can't stress enough that the organization itself, be it the board, the leadership, they really need to be invested in this type of important work. One, on a financial standpoint, you know, for sustainability and also community impact. So, and audience development, and all that is a part of an organization's sustainability. So, the organizational leadership needs to be invested in this type of relationship building because it takes time, it takes resources, but the outcomes is profound, you know. And I've seen firsthand predominantly white institutions, be it my alma mater, American University. I graduated from the Master's Arts Management program when I was in during my academic work there. I was one of 3 African Americans in my class. Fast forward some odd years later, the department is heavily diverse, and the conversations are intersectional as far as their pedagogy. So it can happen, but the only way it happened is because there was a departmental and institutional push for it to happen, right? So, and then working at organizations like the Creative Alliance in Baltimore, who was a predominantly white organization not too long ago, as far as leadership and staffing, there was a strong institutional push within their leadership for more diversity and inclusion. And let me tell you, working there, the process at times was difficult. It was, but now they're a much larger organization. They're a much supported organization. The audience is a lot more diverse and larger. So the work is necessary, and the outcomes are rewarding. That was really long-winded, but it was such a good question.
Can I just piggyback on what Chanel just said? Because I think that's so important that you have the institutional support. And I've been very, very fortunate with CCBC and how supportive they've been. And in fact, they were really the ones that initiated some of the research I've been doing on African descended people on that particular piece of land and the extended area. They've been very, very supportive, both financially, both just in every way imaginable. And I would say that there are now, and just talking from the university perspective as a professor, that now universities are now coming to grips and now really addressing the fact that some very painful, traumatic, tragic things happened on the land that now these students, including African American students, because it talks about the importance of place, to hear these black students walking on the University of Virginia and Georgetown and Dartmouth and all of these other places that used to have enslaved populations there, pretty much doing all of the work on those areas, but that college campuses are now starting to really understand the importance of addressing these issues. We all know what Georgetown has done. Is it was the first to offer some money to people who descended from the people that they own. But I think it's important to understand that the leadership of these predominantly white institutions has to embrace the painful part of this and understand that that's still part of what's going on today on their campuses, and that to pull a blanket over it, to put a veil in front of it, is actually going to be more painful in the long run by negating the importance of these stories. So I just wanted to, I guess, sort of a long-winded thing of saying that what Chanel was saying is that these institutions need to be supportive, and that really comes from, making sure you're hiring the proper people, making sure that there is enthusiasm about being honest about things that might not even be something that are that's positive, that you still have to accept the good with the bad and not always believe that dominant narrative. And we hear the dominant narrative of American history, and it doesn't bring any of those marginalized voices of women, of people of color, of people of different religions and other ethnicities into play. And that's important across the board, that these institutions become more open to those things, even if it might shed a negative light on those institutions for the short period of time. But by embracing them, it's going to be better in the long run.
I think another point to add in to answer this question as well is back again to this professional development and figuring out, and I think this is something that we all probably struggle with in the public history field and some more than others, but making sure that the people who are in power in our organizations understand the importance of continuing professional development, so that we know the changes in the field and the trends, and so that we are continually updating our interpretation to reflect the new trends, the new scholarship that's out. Oftentimes we don't have time to do these trainings or read this most up-to-date research. So if a site has an interpretation that has stayed the same for 20, 30 years, it's not, addressing all of these new things. It's not looking at slavery from the perspective of the Atlantic world. It's not looking at, new scholarship about sexuality within the Black community. It's not looking at a whole host of things. So I think it's important for us to collectively kind of push for those things to happen, and hopefully maybe this particular historical moment is going to help in terms of us being able to access more online resources to get the continuing development that we need.
Oh, shucks.
Thank you, Dennis. I would like us to close out now. I wanted to see if any of our presenters wanted to add one more thought before we left. I want to give you that opportunity because I know you all had a lot to say, and we've talked a bit about maybe making this a repeat situation. But before we close out this presentation, I want to give you that opportunity.
Yeah, well, one of the last questions was what African American institutions are successfully broadening the narrative of Black storytelling. And I will have to do a shameless plug, not too shameless, of course, which is the Banneker-Douglass Museum, Maryland State Museum on African American History and Culture, where I'm the executive director. And we have a small but mighty staff, and we are broadening our community partnership to do more intersectional storytelling. So we have one exhibit up now called the Black Vote Mural Project, which highlights the history of African Americans in the vote. And, 2020 is an election year, and it's the 100th anniversary of the women's suffrage movement. And we really wanted to create an opportunity to onboard community partners and a guest curator that prioritize on inclusive-based identity programming. We have a diverse array of local artists who are diverse in age, gender, sexual orientation, and whose work speaks to that, and how African American, what has been the relationship, the diverse relationship with African American communities and the vote and empowerment. So definitely, when things open back up, everyone's welcome to check out that exhibit. We'll be doing some virtual programming and virtual tours of the exhibit and discussions with the artists as well. It's an incredibly powerful and timely exhibit.
Lindsay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great. I somehow dropped off of things, and I wasn't sure that you, but I'm still here. Gosh.
Okay. So thank you, Chanel, for the plug. I want to see the exhibit. I've seen the previews, and it looks great. I want to thank all of our presenters for being so flexible and understanding of the shift from in-person in OELA to online in our homes. I also want to thank the Maryland Heritage Areas program for their support and letting us use this platform and helping to organize the workshop. And also all of our participants, because I know we're all probably in our homes with kids and dogs and significant others and roommates and lots of distractions. So thankfully, we'll have this recorded. I thank you for taking the time to join us, but we'll have it recorded in case you thought you missed anything, or if you signed up but didn't make it onto the call, you should have access to this. And there's a distinct possibility that with the cooperation of our wonderful presenters, that we might have another iteration of this in the future.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you. Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, this has been great, Lindsay. Really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you for putting this together. It's important. Thank you very much for having me.
Goodbye.
bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.